Hi, my name is Sarah Hodge, and I'm the curator of the Herman Teapot National Inland Waterways Library. I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope you're enjoying the program so far. If you haven't already, make sure you've watched the introductory tour video and the video on how to use our digital library. Both can be found on the Educational Series webpage in parts 1 and 2. In this video, you'll learn how to analyze primary sources to expand your understanding of topics in history. We'll be doing this by examining early American immigration. After the video, you'll find a follow-up assignment that will guide you through finding and analyzing primary sources on your own. From the two videos you've already seen, you should have a pretty good understanding of what a research library is and the role it plays in collecting and preserving primary sources. You should also know how to use our digital library to access these sources. So now, let's take a look at how we can use these tools to better understand our past. Let's start with a question. What influence did immigration have on early American culture, politics, and the economy? We'll use primary sources to explore this question, but first we'll need to go over a little background on the subject. Before we dive into the history, I want to address migration in the context of displacement. We have to be careful when we talk about America growing and expanding westward. We have to also acknowledge the millions of indigenous people who were pushed from their ancestral lands as a result. This often occurred through deceit and acts of violence. We don't have time in this short presentation to explore this complex injustice, but it is important to recognize. You can't fully understand early American immigration unless viewing it in the context of displacement. You can find more information on the subject in the additional resources link under this video. The United States is frequently described as a nation of immigrants. Today, more than 40 million immigrants live in the U.S. In fact, right now, more immigrants live in the U.S. than in any other country in the world. The reasons people immigrate have barely changed in the last 500 years. Economic opportunity, religious freedom, and safety from violence or famine are at the top of the list. North America has experienced consistent waves of immigration since Europeans first explored the continent in the 16th century. Americans encouraged relatively free and open immigration during the 18th and most of the 19th centuries. Around 650,000 individuals arrived in America before 1820. About 60% were English and Welsh, but there were also German, Irish, French, Spanish, Dutch, and others. America didn't extend beyond the Mississippi River until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Before then, the West remained mostly under indigenous control, though the displacement we talked about earlier had already begun. French and Spanish explorers and fur traders had spent the last 100 years establishing scattered forts and trading posts along major rivers. These early outsiders weren't there to settle down and start communities, though. They were there to harvest and extract materials like furs and to form military alliances. It was this growing trade that eventually began to draw people westward to form settlements. Steamboat technology in the first half of the 19th century made travel to the region more accessible. St. Louis was perfectly located to serve as the gateway to the West. It sits at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and isn't far from the confluence with the Ohio River. The population of St. Louis increased by 228% between 1810 and 1820. It doubled between 1835 and 1840 and doubled again by 1845. By 1850, 43% of all St. Louisans were born in either Ireland or Germany. Railroads were connected to the region in the mid-19th century, making it even more accessible and affordable to travel to. On the eve of the Civil War, St. Louis led the country in percentage of its population not born in the U.S. By 1870, over half of the people in St. Louis were first-generation immigrants. Individual states started passing immigration legislation after the Civil War. In 1875, the Supreme Court declared immigration regulation a federal responsibility. After passing the Immigration Act of 1891, the federal government took over inspecting, admitting, rejecting, and processing all immigrants. By this time, the majority of immigrants coming to the U.S. were from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. Around 600,000 Italians immigrated to America between 1890 and 1900. Jews fleeing religious persecution in Eastern Europe also arrived in large numbers. Over 2 million arrived between 1880 and 1920. Immigrants played an important role in the transition to an urban industrial economy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were drawn to big cities in the North and Midwest in search of employment. They tended to complement the needs of local economies, spurring economic growth. Low-skilled newcomers provided labor for industrialization, while higher-skilled arrivals drove innovations in agriculture and manufacturing. By 1900, immigrants made up roughly 75% of the populations of America's largest cities. This included New York, Chicago, Boston, Cleveland, San Francisco, Milwaukee, and Detroit. So now that we've looked at a brief history of early American immigration, let's get back to our question. What influence did immigration have on early American culture, politics, and the economy? How can we use the collection of the St. Louis Mercantile Library to answer this question and to understand what life was really like for the immigrants who settled here in Missouri? When you talk about statistics and large numbers of people, it's easy to forget that each number is an individual person, a person with friends and family and a complex history full of triumphs and regrets, good times and bad. A person, for better or worse, just like us. Not only will primary sources give you insightful first-hand accounts of the immigrant experience, but they also help your research stay grounded, recognizing the humanity behind immigration. As we learned earlier, the largest populations of immigrants coming to Missouri in the 19th century were German and Irish. So let's start by taking a look at Irish immigration. Between 1820 and 1930, around 4.5 million Irish immigrants came to the U.S. Ireland experienced a terrible famine in the mid-19th century. In the 1840s, almost half of America's immigrants were from Ireland alone. They were usually impoverished and settled close to their point of arrival along the East Coast. For many, it cost too much to travel further inland. Irish immigrants often found jobs as laborers in big cities. They helped build a lot of the country's infrastructure, including railroads, canals, and roads. For this reason, many were also pro-slavery. They feared freed African Americans would flood the job market with competition, driving wages lower. Robert Campbell was an early Irish immigrant. He came to the U.S. in 1822 at the age of 18. A year after arriving, he made his way westward to St. Louis looking for work. Campbell took a position working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and became a legendary fur trapper and mountain man. He secured wealth and land, then returned to St. Louis with quite the reputation. He became one of the city's wealthiest citizens, finding success as a fur trader, banker, outfitter, and merchant. He was also a member and supporter of the St. Louis Mercantile Library. The Mercantile Library has acquired a large collection of Campbell's business records, legal papers, receipts, and personal correspondence. The collection offers a glimpse at the sprawling trade network Campbell developed and the massive impact the single Irish immigrant had on shaping the American West. Let's take a closer look at a primary source from the Robert Campbell family collection. This letter, dated July 29, 1867, is from Campbell's clerk, David Rankin, to a business associate, James McGee. It documents a transaction conducted on behalf of Campbell. In the letter, Rankin writes, "We have invested in buffalo tongues as requested. Tongues have been very scarce for several years and the price is very high." He finishes the letter by mentioning, "Mr. Robert Campbell is now on a visit to Europe with his family, probably at present in your city, where they will make a short stay and proceed to Paris." What does this piece tell us? Well, first, we learn who Campbell was conducting business with, where they lived, and what goods were exchanged. This helps us understand the vast reach of his business empire. We also learn the value of certain goods and commodities. On its own, this doesn't tell us much, but combined with other documents, it gives us a detailed look into the early American economy. You'll also note buffalo tongues were described as scarce. This makes sense since buffalo were hunted to near extinction. Early settlers trying to build lives for themselves were rarely concerned with the environmental impact of their actions. But the impact was there nonetheless, whether through loss of biodiversity, deforestation, or even chemical runoff from treating hundreds of thousands of animal pelts. And finally, Campbell is a great example of seeing beyond numbers and statistics when we talk about immigration. We learn that many Irish immigrants arrived impoverished and settled close to their point of arrival, or in major cities throughout the North and Midwest. We also learned that many worked as unskilled laborers. This was all initially true in Campbell's case as well. He was the youngest child of his father's second wife, so was set to inherit nothing. He followed his brother to America with essentially nothing to his name. But Campbell wasn't just a fixed statistic. He was a person who went on to live a remarkable life and become one of the most influential business leaders of his time. The last section of this letter highlights Campbell's American success story. Campbell came to Philadelphia in 1822 at the age of 18. Fast forward 45 years later to the time this letter was written, and he was touring Europe with his family. This really serves as a testament to Campbell's wealth and status in society. Now let's take a look at German immigration. The first major wave of Germans came to Missouri in the 1830s. Only 18 German families lived in St. Louis in 1833, but around 6,000 German immigrants lived here just 4 years later. Promotional literature, written by early settlers and immigration societies, circulated wildly back in Germany. They described romantic scenes of a bountiful American Rhineland. Eager to escape crowding, many sought to establish modest farms and dedicated German towns in the Midwest. Hermann, Missouri, just west of St. Louis, was one of these towns. German settlers also established German neighborhoods in cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. By segregating themselves, they maintained their German heritage and identity throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. It wasn't until the strong anti-German backlash following World War I that Missouri's German heritage began to erode. Immigrant newspapers played an important role in Missouri's various immigrant communities. The papers kept communities connected, reporting on issues of local and national interest while promoting immigrant-run businesses and organizations. The Anzeiger des Westens was the first German newspaper in St. Louis. Its first issue was published on October 31, 1835. Other papers quickly followed. During the 1840s and 50s, there were about 10 German newspapers in St. Louis alone. The Mercantile Library has acquired an outstanding collection of these early German newspapers. The articles and advertisements provide us invaluable insight into the lives of Missouri's early German settlers. We can use these sources to learn what was important to them and how they reacted to the changing world around them. Let's take a closer look at a clipping from one of these newspapers. Here we have an excerpt from the 1862 Westliche Post, a St. Louis German newspaper. The article is titled "From Hermann, Freedom Triumphs." Here's a rough translation. Probably never, dear editorial staff, was I so proud of our Hermann. As we spoke, wrote, and voted, so did we also act, and our bold word has been gloriously sealed by the Mail Act. Many slaves escaped from Louder Island and found lodging as freelance workers with farmers in our neighborhood. Several of their previous owners tried to convince our good squire to issue a warrant last week in order to snatch their black property from us. Yesterday the gentleman succeeded. The deputy sheriff immediately caught 4 young Negroes and put them in the county jail. But now the people rose in fine majesty. The news of this disgrace passed through town and surroundings like wildfire. The brave Germans clustered together, curses, threats, and curses against the slave owner and her helper. It was agreed unanimously that the poor Negroes should be free people by morning, whether by legal means or by storming the jail by bloodshed, no matter. Gasconade County is not supposed to be a slave hunting area, and Hermann's free Germans do not want to be the scold and mockery of the country. Calm-thinking citizens moved excited people to postpone any use of force until 9 p.m. At 9 in the evening, the men came back with guns and crushing tools and were about to leave for the jail when the most anticipated dispatch arrived. General Curtis issued an order to release the Negroes. You can imagine the jubilation. We gave them a good evening meal and some good farmers took them to night quarters. Hooray for union and freedom. So what did this article just tell us? These citizens display a revolutionary spirit in their willingness to take on town officials and storm the jail to uphold their principles of justice. The failed German Revolution of 1848 sparked an unprecedented wave of immigration. Over the following 10 years, over 1 million people left Germany to settle in the United States. Around 35,000 Germans arrived in St. Louis in the 3 years following the Revolution. These immigrants brought their fighting spirit with them. Many were also vocal opponents of slavery. Missouri's German newspapers often printed anti-slavery articles and literature. The Hermanner Wochenblatt, which was founded in Hermann, Missouri in 1845, published installments of Uncle Tom's Cabin for 26 weeks. Many historians credit the political activism of Missouri's Germans with keeping Missouri in the Union during the Civil War. The disproportionate number of immigrants settling in the North may also have given the Union forces a manpower advantage that contributed to their victory. In this article, the author shows a disgust at the way their town might be perceived nationally, with scold and mockery if they allow slave hunting in their area. I want to note there's a difference between being anti-slavery and recognizing the moral injustice of slavery. You can see echoes of societal racism in the language used to tell this story. Many people, German immigrants included, were against the economic system of slavery without questioning the racial basis of the institution. Free Soil Democrats were a group trying to halt the expansion of slavery while not supporting its outright end. Many German immigrants supported this movement, wanting Western lands reserved for small farmers and artisans rather than large plantations fueled by the labor of enslaved people. Although relatively few Chinese immigrants made their way to Missouri in the 19th century, there were massive waves of them settling elsewhere, particularly on the West Coast. Their social, political, and economic impact could be felt throughout the nation, including here in Missouri. Civil War and famine devastated southern China in the 19th century. The California gold rush that began in 1848 promised riches and a new life to those brave enough to seize it. Over 25,000 Chinese immigrants had migrated to California by 1850. Most were single men who sought to provide better lives for their families back home. Here we have a political cartoon by Thomas Nast, another German immigrant. Nast was an illustrator and cartoonist. After his death in 1902, the New York Times eulogized him as the father of the American political cartoon. Many of his cartoons feature themes of social justice and strong criticism of anti-immigrant rhetoric. This piece by Nast is from Harper's Weekly, which was an American political magazine started in 1857. The piece is titled "Every Dog, No Distinction of Color, Has Its Day," and was published February 8, 1879. The drawing features a male Native American looking over the shoulder of a Chinese immigrant. They are both dressed in stereotypical garb, but their demeanor and facial expressions show them thoughtful and alert as they read signs posted on a public declaration board. This is in contrast to the African American man relaxing against a wall in the background, next to a sign that reads, "My day is coming." These signs are a classic Nast device featured in many of his works. He used them to convey shades of meaning to his illustrations, often through political speech. In this piece, the signs contain hate speech and anti-immigrant rhetoric. The largest and most prominent poster in the cartoon addresses the so-called Chinese problem. It provides a solution of prohibiting Chinese immigration to the United States. There are anti-German and anti-Irish signs displayed as well. At the top center is a simple illustration of an indigenous man fleeing westward, being chased by a train. Below that is a Chinese man fleeing eastward, beating a drum labeled "cheap labor." The Chinese man is chasing after a train. The caption for the cartoon reads, "Red gentleman to yellow gentleman. Pale face, 'fraid you crowd him out as he did me." So what can we learn from this piece? Throughout his career, Nast drew numerous cartoons calling out the anti-Chinese sentiment gripping the nation. This work illustrates how pervasive fear and resentment of immigrants has been in our country's history. The signs featured in the image capture popular anti-immigrant rhetoric that followed each major wave of immigration. Nast also draws a direct line from the fears of Chinese immigration displacing white Americans to the displacement indigenous peoples suffered. His caption says it all: red gentleman to yellow gentleman, pale face, 'fraid you crowd him out as he did me. The cartoon highlights the connection between Chinese immigrants and railroads. The gold rush peaked by 1852 and was over by the end of the decade. Hardened by their gold mining experience, many of these immigrants turned to the Transcontinental Railroad for work. Historians estimate Chinese immigrants comprised about 80% of the total workforce on the Transcontinental Railroad. The work was grueling and dangerous, blasting and carving tunnels through mountainsides and towering snowdrifts. After the project was completed in 1869, the immigrants once again found themselves in need of work. The largest and most prominent poster in the cartoon addresses the so-called Chinese problem. It calls for a law prohibiting future Chinese immigration and banishing existing immigrants. Many Americans saw the Chinese as unwanted competition for jobs, particularly after the railroad was completed. Nearly 3 years after this piece was published, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act banned further immigration of Chinese workers into the United States, just like the poster in this piece is calling for. Through this cartoon, we have confirmation that the ideas behind the exclusion law were widely popular years before it was passed, and that it seemed almost an inevitable outcome by this point. There were many other groups of immigrants that played important roles in forming the U.S. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover them all, and honestly, we've barely scratched the surface on the ones we have covered. But I do want to talk about one last major demographic. From the 17th to 19th century, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to America against their will. By 1680, there were some 7,000 Africans in the American colonies. By 1790, that number had grown to nearly 700,000. Congress outlawed the importation of enslaved people in 1808, but the inhumane practice continued for some time afterward. By 1860, African Americans accounted for 10% of Missouri's total population. So my question for you is, were enslaved people immigrants? Historians differ on this point. What is an immigrant? How do we define the term? Not only in the dictionary, but also socially. Are free will and choice part of the definition? Does intent matter? If you're doing this program with your class, now would be a great time to pause the video and have a discussion. If you're doing the video on your own, take a moment and think this question over. So we looked at personal letters and business documents, newspapers and political cartoons. We talked about Irish, German, and Chinese immigration. We also talked about migration and displacement and whether enslaved Africans were considered immigrants. So now, let's try to answer our research question and draw some conclusions about the economic, political, and cultural effects of early American immigration. We learned that immigrants typically stimulated growth because they complemented the needs of local economies. Low-skilled newcomers provided labor, as we saw with the Irish and Chinese immigrants, while higher-skilled arrivals spurred innovation in agriculture and manufacturing. Their impact on the economy was often only visible on a large scale, rather than at the individual level. But in Robert Campbell's extraordinary case, the impact of his trade network was vast. His fur trade and business deals and those of his close associates formed the backbone of the economy in the West. We also learned that immigrants were critical to building the nation's infrastructure, including railroads, canals, bridges, and roads. Chinese immigrants looking for work after the end of the gold rush were instrumental to constructing the Transcontinental Railroad. This railroad served to connect the country physically and also symbolically after we had emerged from a divisive civil war. We learned that slavery as a political institution was intensely challenged by German immigrants who wanted to keep land available to small farmers and artisans. By contrast, it was supported by many Irish immigrants who were in direct competition with freed blacks in the job market. We also learned that Missouri's Germans' fight against slavery was instrumental in keeping Missouri in the Union during the Civil War, and that the massive number of immigrants flocking to the North and Midwest likely bolstered Union forces, contributing to their victory. We learned about waves of immigration influencing government policies, such as the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the 1891 Federal Immigration Act. We learned that immigrants brought unique perspectives and cultural identities to America, and that many formed separate communities to preserve their cultural heritage. We learned that newspapers were often at the heart of these communities, helping them stay connected. Finally, we learned that waves of immigration were almost always followed by strong anti-immigrant backlash. Such was the case with the Irish, Germans, and Chinese of the 19th century. So let's review how we can use primary sources to enhance our understanding of topics in history. You start with a question. Then you search for as many primary sources as possible. The more the better. Find a variety of materials that represent various perspectives, like newspapers, personal letters, diaries, and even cartoons. Compare and contrast them, highlighting similarities and differences. Consider the biases of the author and also your own. Then piece what you found together to form a narrative, understanding the big picture through its individual parts. Finally, use this narrative to answer your question. So now you've learned about the St. Louis Mercantile Library and what we do, the type of collections we house, what primary sources are, how to access them using our digital library, and now how to analyze them to answer historical research questions. Next, you'll open the follow-up assignment, which will guide you through using our digital library to pull primary sources. You'll then analyze these sources and answer questions. Make sure you open the assignment that goes with this presentation, the one on early American immigration. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at shodge@umsl.edu. Thanks for watching and happy researching.